Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to talk about female initiation, the ferocity and grit, verve and nerve it takes to claim authority and personhood in this process. It has been imaged in many a fairy tale and in mythology. Of course, we are all in favor of that, so stay tuned as we unpack this, circumambulate it, and exhibit perhaps a little ferocity on behalf of this topic and women out there everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an interest of mine for a while, and it's definitely something that I see in my practice, and I've had my own story with it. And I will say that I see a particular arc that happens for many women where they have been socialized perhaps to be appealing and compatible and accommodating.
And nice.
And that at some point in their life arc, they need to figure out how to stand in their own authority. And what that requires is a confrontation with an integration of shadow material. You can't really hold authority until you've dealt with your shadow, until you've gotten to know your shadow. And you can't really carry authority until you have access to your aggressive capacity. And for some women, that's hard. I want to just clarify, this is not true for all women. For whatever reason, there are some women who come into adulthood and have their hands already on this. But for some women, this is something that they have to grow into.
Do you think there is a unique process that women go through to claim their shadow, to discover it and claim it, that's unique to that sex?
Well, I think it's unique in that for many women, again, not all, aggression is really much more in the shadow. It's just not as culturally acceptable for women to be aggressive, at least in some milieus. And I'm not saying that it's culturally acceptable for all men to be aggressive. I'm not saying that. But I'm just saying that the sexes have slightly different relationships with aggression. And women learning to access their aggressive capacity is often its own thing, which maybe looks slightly differently than a man who needs to have that same experience. And many men do.
I think somehow masculinity and aggressiveness are not so incompatible. We have warriors, heroes, combatants, football players, all kinds of images of aggression and the masculine principle. And I remember being told once that the only time aggression is sanctioned in a woman is when she is defending her young, the mother bear or mother lioness kind of image. So I think it's a little bit more unusual for women. And I think we need to be clearer about what aggression looks like. It doesn't have to look like, Amazons on horseback with bows and arrows. I think it's more tied to claiming authority of this is what I want, this is my judgment, this is my decision, and I'm going to stand on this and with this.
Yeah, I really like the term aggressive capacity. As you will note, I keep on using that rather than aggression, because aggression does make it sound like we're talking about physical violence. Mm-hmm. And what I'm actually talking about when I use that phrase is finding some connection with that energy within, which can be a little flinty, a little cold, maybe even a little mean sometimes. And to just know that it's there and to be able to tap into it when appropriate.
Well, I feel like we're backing away from the word very quickly. And that may be part of the complex in and of itself. But if we stay with the word aggressive, that the word aggressive is connected to the word attack. And attack often evokes images of military operations, to be in a battle. And so if we don't hedge, but we talk about one's capacity to be in battle, mm-hmm. to me, I think that that's valid. Mm-hmm. Because we can't get to adulthood without going to battle with ourselves, going to battle with values that we have outgrown, going to battle with social agreements which are no longer life-giving to us, going to battle with relationships that we do or do not want any longer. And that battle takes choice and strategy. Mm-hmm. To be in a battle, whether we're a man or a woman, requires thought. And underneath that, will, access to will.
Well, and the way you're describing it, Joseph, which I think is really helpful, you're also making it clear that it's a conscious choice.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes aggression in, let's say, uninitiated women doesn't seem like a conscious choice. It's more of a fevered reaction that can come across as shrill and ineffective.
Yes.
And again, I mean, this can be true of men too, right? I'm not trying to draw a bright line.
No, but we're interested in women's psychology and relative to some of the fairy tales we'll be talking about.
Right. So the thing about being in conscious relationship, and maybe that's why I'm using in this term of aggressive capacity, is that you have some conscious relationship with it. Yes, this situation requires me to be in battle, and I am going to choose to engage in battle over this issue or whatever.
I want to distinguish this, which ties to my use of the word authority, from being reactive and being, as you said, Lisa, shrill, that it's not about protesting necessarily the other or what other people want you to do or any of that stuff. I think there is a place where it is so centered in self that it's less about you, whoever the you might be, than it is about, I like your word will, Joseph, of I will go in this direction. I am choosing something for myself. And it may flout cultural convention. It may, have to do with relationship or anything else, but it is acting in service to self and choice more than it is reacting against, this or that or the other thing.
Well, and Deb, what you're bringing up, here's where it takes me, is when we stop being so concerned about the other, mm-hmm. right? Either that the other has done something to upset us, or we feel we need to take care of the other. it's like we can choose to disregard the relational aspects of the issue, and we can focus on what we need. And
Yeah.
again, for some women, this is really a radical thing because we've maybe always operated in this relational frame where we're really tending to the other in whatever way, and our actions are reactions to the other person in some
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And this brings up, you know, I mean, I know we're going to move into this story later, but when in Psyche and Eros, her last task is she has to go to the underworld and bring back Persephone's beauty box. She's warned, when you go into Hades, be careful because the shades are going to pull at your hem and you must disregard them. So this is something that many women have to learn, is that there is a time to disregard the needs of others, to ignore what others want from you, and to not be reactive to the needs or wants or, you know, insults that other people throw at you, but just remain very in reference to self, as you were saying, Deb.
To remain centered in self and also to take action. And that mythological reference is perfect because that was her decision and that was her action, is to march on centered in self because she was on a very important and vital mission for herself. So she didn't argue with the shades. She didn't protest. She didn't justify why she was going down there and why I really can't stop and help you, but maybe later I can come back. Nope. Take action and just forego arguments, words, justifications. Do what you got to do. Positive, productive, powerful action is often the key.
What do you think thwarts that? Because I would imagine that when I think of children, often children have a lot of volition. Little girls and little boys, they see something, they walk over in the playroom, they grab it and they mess with it, and then they toss it aside, and then they ask and they cry when they're hungry. It seems like little boys and little girls both start out with a kind of passion and a clarity around their needs.
So this is right in the area of that book, Reviving Ophelia by Mary Pfeiffer, I think her name is. And what she talks about in the book is exactly the way that girls change around the beginning of adolescence. I think the key age is like 12.
Mm-hmm.
And they lose some of that ferocity, and they lose some of that agency and initiative, and they become much more focused on being pleasing, worrying about how they look. There's this kind of confidence drop that's been noted in all of this literature. There's actually a big body of literature about this, and I wish I could speak to it more coherently. But once upon a time, a very long time ago, I taught high school at an all-girls school. And we talked a lot about this, about the way that girls are in classrooms. Now, maybe this is a long time ago and perhaps no longer relevant. That would be nice. But at that time, I remember one of the things that we did was we observed the way that we went to a private school that was co-ed, and we just sat in on the classes and observed what happened. And the girls just didn't tend to raise their hands very much. They deferred to the boys a lot. So, you know, this was sort of the, you know, the justification for all female secondary education was that it tended to render girls feeling more confident because there wasn't this dynamic. Now, Joseph, to your question, is that social? Is that cultural? Is there something hardwired there? And the answer is, I'm just going to say, I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know either, but I have a very sharp, distinct memory from ninth grade that has no doubt been infused with later insights and imagination. But I was very aware in ninth grade of, at that time, felt super tall, and I was compared to the boys. And a bit of an outlier in a lot of ways, but making a very conscious decision about whether I was going to go my own way or whether I wanted to be a girl Isn't that funny? And it had nothing to do with sexual orientation. I don't think I was even awake to what that meant, really. But that I realized that there was something about belonging that I wanted very badly. And that what I wanted was to be a girl and seen as a girl and accepted in the community of girls who were very oriented around clothes and social stuff and whole hair and all the rest of it. And I made a decision that I wanted to belong. And so I used my clothing allowance to buy what was the fashion rage at that time, which was a Loden coat. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that you weren't supposed to buy a red Loden coat. It had to be beige or green. So that was my first big decision.
And you got it wrong.
And I got it wrong, but I kept trying.
When I sink into that with my imagination, we're talking about the awakening of sexuality, the drive to pair bond, which is based on sexual connection and sexual tension. So how does it change a young woman, a young man for that matter, when all of a sudden being considered sexually viable becomes an enormous imperative? And how does that reshape other priorities? And I suspect a large part of that is genetic, is part of the life force of becoming fertile and being young.
Yeah, and of course, culture then inscribes exactly how we do that and how we signal that. And for whatever reason, part of what happens in our culture is that girls do lose this sense of ferocity. And they do become, many of them, again, not all of them, many of them become very accommodating and pleasing. And then, so this need to initiate in adulthood and claim some of what got cut away at this critical stage becomes an important life task.
And I'm thinking that if I go back to adolescence and young women, how powerful the culture was then and probably now in dictating what those norms were and seducing young women into believing that being attractive, appealing, and responsive, and then being chosen to get married and have a home and have children was the initiatory experience. And I'm not saying that it isn't or that it's not worthwhile and it's not important. Of course it is. But we're talking today about that other inner force and reclaiming a certain kind of drive for selfhood that is not so relationally and culturally determined.
Let's deepen that, because I think we need to unpack what the word initiation means.
Yeah,
oh, right. Good idea.
We're talking, because we talk about this all the time. So, and rightly so, there are different kinds of initiations, as you were saying, Deb. Having a baby, giving birth, life transforming, soul transforming initiations, in as much as we are in one way of being, and then a extraordinary psychophysical event occurs, and we are in a totally different way of being that we've transformed to another valence.
Yeah.
That we don't bounce back from.
That's great, Joseph. I want to share, Michael Mead is a mythologist who's written a lot on initiation. He has a beautiful book called The Water of Life. It's just filled with all these gorgeous quotes about initiation that I could just read the whole time. But I'll share this one because I think it gets at what you're saying, Joseph, and kind of prompts us to think about initiation in this psychological sense that we're talking about. He says, initiatory events are those that mark a person's life forever, that pull them more deeply into the waters of life than they would normally choose to go. What initiates us also strips us down to the inner essentials and releases qualities and powers that were hidden within.
So there's something there about being pulled into or acting against the usual kind of valence for one's life, or even against one's own ego-oriented impulses and desires.
And if we think about, sort of anthropological sense of initiation, there's often an event that happens at the threshold of adulthood. But psychologically, this recurs throughout the lifespan, that we are reinitiated at any major junction in our development.
And today we're particularly interested in a specific initiation when a woman who perhaps has not felt access to her fire, her volitional will, comes through a transformational experience and emerges on the other side feeling that this is now in her hand, something that she can apply by choice and apply to achieve her goals and wishes and to shape her environment in a way that is very more potent than she might have imagined previously. So how does that happen? Or what are examples of that happening?
Well, I think certainly one way that happens, and it has happened over and over again in fairy tales, is through trauma.
Okay, like an involuntary initiation.
It's either, sort of the sink or swim thing where, Snow White has to hightail it off and get away from her evil queen mother. Cinderella has to decide that she is bloody well going to go to that ball, come hell or high water. Vasilisa has to go out into the forest to get fire from the Baba Yaga, who is ferocious and scary. So something pushes us into a new pathway that we have had to encounter. We have to embrace it. Persephone gets abducted into Hades, and then we find out that we can survive, and we are more than we thought we were.
Michael Mead actually says somewhere, I think, that initiation can either happen through grief or through desire. And I think the trauma model, which is definitely initiatory, that's grief. We come in contact with something dark and we have to contend with it. And in doing that, we recognize that we have more in us than we knew. And it changes our relationship with our sense of purpose. It changes our relationship with the universe, in effect. But desire can also initiate. We wind up bumping up against something because we want something. I always think of the quintessential image of initiation by desire as being that moment in Oliver Twist, where he draws the straw and he has to go up and ask for more. And asking for more, that is the moment where he's cast out and he actually is sent into the underworld. He goes and is sold to be an apprentice to an undertaker. And then he winds up being in a different kind of underworld in London when he meets up with Fagin. So it is this plunge into the underworld. But it starts because he dares to want more. And for me, I'm thinking about an initiatory process, which was training, analytic training. And, I wanted
bet we were
something.
all thinking of that.
Yes. So there I was. I wanted something. And I remember one particular encounter with a training analyst. And I was using my tried and true strategy of being a good student and being very accommodating and being very hardworking. And it wasn't working. It wasn't working. And I was bumping up against this and I was about to get into trouble. And I figured it out. And I recognized that I needed to stop being caught in an innocence complex where I assumed that if I worked hard and did the right thing, I would be taken care of. And the first thing I had to harness was my trickster energy, because I had to recognize that this particular analyst wanted something and I needed to figure out how to give it to her. She didn't want me to just be the good the good student. She needs something different. And I needed to figure out how to meet her needs so that I didn't get bumped out of my ass. And I did. And there were many other occasions during analytic training when I was perhaps going to run aground of something. And I needed to figure out how to deal with it and stop assuming that someone else was going to take care of me just because I was showing up with a smile on my face.
I think what you're saying is so important, Lisa. That innocence complex is just a great phrase. And I'm thinking about James Hollis, a Jungian analyst who's written a number of books, who talks about how Jungians are all recovering nice people. It doesn't have to do with being mean, but it does have to do with holding on to what you want and what you are about and being what I call centered in self. I'm not here to comply with you. I'm not here to please you. Neither am I here to rebel against you, but I am on my own path and I am standing on my own feet.
So a little fairy tale here is Snow White. So Snow White is the picture of innocence. I mean, she's really trapped in an innocence complex and very sweet and lovely. And she's so innocent that she can't even begin to see that the woman at the door is going to hurt her. It's like, come on, you idiot. You know, the dwarves told you not to answer the door and you did, and you almost got killed. And then you're going to answer the door again the next week. I mean, that is an innocence complex where you can't imagine that someone else might be capable of harming you. Jung said something like the best way to deal with the darkness of other people is to deal with your own. And that's why this involves shadow integration. So the interesting thing is that when she finally seems to have apparently died, it's because she's taken a bite of the poison apple, which of course is incredibly irresistible to her because there's all this desire for that which has been split off. So apparently she is in this glass coffin for who knows how long with this piece of poison apple in her mouth. And I think that the transformation that happens to her not as a result of the prince who comes along and rescues her, but because she's spent so long digesting and metabolizing that poison, that she needed that poison to balance out this sickly sweet innocence. She needed to integrate some of the stepmother's nastiness. And
that's brilliant.
Yeah. And then at the end of the story, if you'll remember, what she does is she invites her stepmother, to the wedding. And the stepmother is given a pair of iron shoes that dance her to death. So it's like, okay, now she's got her aggression. She has no trouble finishing off her wicked stepmother in this gruesome way. So this is how it happens: is we have to get over this thing that we're nice and people are going to be nice to us. That ain't how the world works. We need to digest some of the poison apple.
Yeah. I've never heard that interpretation, Lisa, and I really appreciate it, that she was metabolizing shadow in the form of the poisoned apple. And in the story of Persephone and her abduction, sweet thing is picking flowers in the field. Mm-hmm. And these conniving gods, Zeus and Hades, say, okay, you really want her, you can have her. So Hades comes roaring up from underneath in his chariot, takes her down below. And some number of months later, the time frame changes depending on the version of the tale. When she emerges, she is no longer the maiden. She is the queen of the underworld. And that's not nothing. She knew who she was. She knew the kind of power she had. And she had spent some number of months integrating shadow in the underworld. That's such a key piece of finding out who you are, of your own ambition, your own envy, jealousy, power-seeking, selfishness, all of those things, of just discovering it within. That doesn't mean that you have to enact it, but that you know that you are that too.
So, Lisa, I'm still circling around that wonderful interpretation of Snow White being in this stasis, metabolizing the piece of poison apple, the way a caterpillar will be in this kind of liquid mystery while it's
Yeah.
becoming something else in its own time.
Yeah.
And that the mystery that you're talking about is the access to violence, which is a primordial part of nature. I mean, every creature, every insect is violent in service to maintaining its own life. And that human beings also have this violent contending. When that's owned consciously, it becomes bridled to the engine of civilization. And whether or not that leads us to new careers or other kinds of goals, we need that redness to fuel the engine. But how many times do people have an unconscious relationship to violence and anger, and then they come to therapy to vent it? So they have this kind of big kettle bubbling on their internal stove, and then they're spending a lot of time talking about it. You know, they pull the lid off, all the steam releases, the boiling backs down, and then they're very prone to going back into their lives and not taking any effective action around the problems. So there's this unfocused venting, they return to a relaxed state, and then they just kind of keep slouching forward in the trough that they're caught in. That's an unharnessed redness.
Yes. Yeah, and it can cause relationship problems because we all know when someone is secretly furious at us, even if that person is hiding it from him or herself. And it leaks into the relationship. And it's much better to just be honest with yourself that you're angry at your partner and that you want to bring some things up.
You want something to change.
Yeah, or you want to, put your boxing gloves on and get into the ring a little bit. To continue your metaphor of violence, to really be able to tussle, to feel that you're entitled to do so.
And I would like to also add that, in an ideal circumstance, wouldn't it be great in a way if both people put their boxing gloves on and went toe to toe and had it out and were engaged and there was a real encounter in the relational frame? But when and if that doesn't happen, my thought here is, once again, of what is this person, this woman, going to do? That if you cannot do it with the other, more words, more arguments, more justifications, explanations, and protests, stop. Go in the other direction. Turn around and figure out what it is you can do, want to do, and are going to do.
So I think both of you have just been lifting something up that I've thought about. There are people, let's say women in this case, because I think that's really instructive and that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
There's certain women that you look at them and they just hold authority. And I've seen this with very young women, just the way they sit, the way their energy is something. And it's always kind of fascinated me, probably because I wasn't like that when I was a much younger woman. It's like, what is the difference between that person and the person who you can just smell it, that there's no strong stance there, or that she can be easily blown over? And I think you both were just mentioning talking a lot. So women who over-explain, or who kind of who are venting, or over-explain their position, or somewhat apologetic, or talk too quickly, or that sort of up-talk thing that many women do. So it's kind of tone of voice, it's how you speak, it's how you stand. And I think what ties all those things together is, as we've been talking about, it's not a conscious thing most of the time. You're not thinking about how you speak or stand. But if you're in that really rigid relational frame where it's always about the other person, then you're likely to be tentative.
To me, it's the distinction or the transition from being volatile to being volitional.
Hmm.
And they sound the same, but when something is volatile, which comes from the Latin word volatilis, means it's fleeting.
Yeah, I think the root word is flight even.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's just burst of heat, a burst of passion. It's discharged, and then everything is kind of done. Being volitional is having access to choice, desire, direction, and a will to move towards that.
Mm-hmm.
And when we have good access to volition, there is an engine at the front of the train cars, and there is movement happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I keep wanting to come back to this initiation of will, that for a young woman to be able to discover that she can will something into being, and that will is intimately connected to desire.
Mm. Yes.
If we don't know what we want, there's nothing for the will, there's no image for the will to constellate around.
Mm-hmm.
The deeper question is, for someone who has unfocused rage, let's say, is what do you actually want versus just venting the pot
Mm-hmm.
so that you can just relax and stay where you are. And there is something dangerous about desire and wanting and willing.
Yes.
Because it demands change.
Yes. Yep.
We can't reject change, but then still want to feel fine.
Mm-hmm. That's really great, Joseph.
So we have to transgress in order to find our own engine, to find our own power. And it can go down hard to for people to say, wow, I'm taking this responsibility and I am making this decision and I am taking this power that I have into my own hands.
Which will require the dissolution of the old thing.
Yes, it will.
And so we have to give up sentimentality, which is a poor cousin to actual depth of feeling.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's just right. I feel like I want to go back a couple clicks, Joseph, to when you asked, like, what happens at adolescence. And I do think there's something, whether it's cultural or biologically mediated or whatever, where adolescent girls often get very much invested in the relational frame and wanting to take care of each other and everyone else. And of course, this kind of goes back to the work of Carol Gilligan, the psychologist from, I think that was like the 80s or 90s. There's a thing that adolescent girls do a lot that I believe is sometimes called fawning. It's funny because I have a daughter and I listen to her and her friends do. It's like, oh my God, what is that? What is this thing my hair is doing today? Or, oh my God, I did so bad on that math test, but I'm just like bad at everything. Or, they're constantly kind of putting themselves down all the time.
Oh, yes. Oh, and somebody else is supposed to chime in with, oh no, I thought your hair looked really great.
Yes. But it's kind of like, if you think about, it's hard to listen to. But I do get it. It is, and I'm sure I did the same thing. It's kind of like a mutual non-aggression pact. I'm not going to compete with you. I'm not going to be a threat. You're signaling that to the other girls. And I think there's kind of a beautiful image of that in this fairy tale called The Six Swans, where she's basically been rendered speechless. I'm not going to go into the background too much. And she's discovered she can't speak. And she's discovered in the forest by the king's men or whatever. And they start asking her questions. She's up a tree and they're asking her questions. And instead of answering, she takes off her necklace and gives it to them. And they keep on asking. She takes off her jewelry and gives it to them. They keep asking. She takes off one layer of clothing after another until she's just in her shift. And this is her only defense, is to give away what she has. And I do think you see this in women many times, especially young women, is the way of making sure that we don't get attacked or we don't arouse jealousy or envy is we just give things away. It's like, oh no, my hair looks really shitty today or whatever. And it's that same thing. And it works. It has a place. It isn't irrelevant. It isn't always bad, but it kind of eventually leads you with not much of a place to go.
And is this a phenomena within the culture of girls? Is what you're saying? It's between girls?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then the danger is that pattern of relating can then be carried into adulthood in environments where that's disempowering.
Oh, and I think it is to a certain extent. I think that this does happen among adult women as well sometimes too, where there's just there's just a lot of kind of putting yourself down, usually humorously. It can become very refined in this kind of self-deprecating humor that can be hilarious, but really problematic when it's the only tool in your toolbox.
And if it's done unconsciously,
and
like
if it's
anything
done
else.
unconsciously, yes.
One of the things that I want to come back to in terms of the evolving sense of self in young women is this discovery of their sexuality during adolescence. I think that while we could critique how a young girl experiments with her appearance or clothing, or how she is or isn't treated based on that among her peers and among the boys around her, underneath all of the trappings of that is this experiment around the power of sexuality, which is something, I observed this really clearly with my stepdaughter right around this time, that she went through a very interesting and intense experiment with her own appearance to learn how much power her sexuality had on the men around her, the young men around her. And that it was sometimes alarming to watch, as a stepfather, but also really understanding she was learning the controls on that power. And then she became much more temperate as she aged. But it was a very explicit kind of initiation. And I don't know that was so much a giving away of her redness, of her volition. It was her noticing that she had an influence on boys, and she needed to know how that worked.
Yeah, that certainly is a kind of power that I think, that is something that girls are learning about and coming into. And of course, it isn't always unambivalent, because it can sometimes, bring on desires. A girl experimenting that way might have experiences that are actually traumatizing.
What's an example of that?
Well, I mean, if she's at a party with the boys and one of them corners her and tries to rape her. I've heard that story.
Absolutely. I would like to decouple that from a girl's initiation into the power of her sexuality. I think that is a really problematic kind of connection, and feels like a non sequitur to me. I think that a girl understanding that she is powerfully beautiful and that she has an effect on the desires of the boys around her, to be conscious of that and exploring that actually protects her from being put in situations where she is being naive or offering too much in an environment that could be dangerous for her, which goes back to the moment with the witch at the door, when the dwarves, the instinctive part, should be saying, stop, don't open the door. This isn't the right place, for you.
I see your point, Joseph, that if you really know that you have that power, then you know how to wield it, and you're less likely to be victimized by it. And I want to tell you, and I don't think you understand this, is that it is both powerful for a woman to feel herself to be the object of a man's desire and frightening. And I don't think that is just me. I think that is nearly universal.
Well, this may be part of that issue of initiation, that for a young woman who doesn't feel initiated, to recognize that she is an object of desire and not know how to negotiate that, not have a mentor, not feel that her sexuality is coupled by a sense of selfhood, as you were saying, Deb, then we're not talking about initiation. And being uninitiated can feel very frightening in a world of adults that are moving with a lot of agency and a lot of intensity.
Right.
And remember, these are young women. These are teenagers. You know how much selfhood consciousness is there in a 14-year-old or an 18-year-old for that matter. And you also landed on a word that I want to lift up here, which is mentored. And that young women and older women, but I think need accompanying, and they need mentoring, and that goes back into the mists of time with grandmothers and fairy godmothers and all kinds of images of women who shape, guide, lead a young woman into more consciousness.
Well, and there's a couple of fairy tales about that. And then there are also some good films about that. And just really quickly, it's not a fairy tale, it's an ancient myth. It's the myth of Inanna and Arushka Gall that I believe we've probably talked about a million times on the podcast before. But just really quickly, Inanna is kind of an Aphrodite type goddess in the Babylonian pantheon. And she goes down to visit her sister, who is queen of the underworld, Arushka Gall. She gets down there. Her sister's not a nice person. She kills her. Interestingly, Inanna has to remove all of her jewelry and clothing, much like in the fairy tale that I just mentioned a minute ago. And then when she gets down there naked to the underworld, she's killed and hung on a meat peg to rot. Now she's eventually rescued, but when she's rescued, she now has the eyes of death. She returns to the upper world with the ability to kill you by looking at you. So she's gone down there. She's been mentored by her dark sister. And now she has integrated that aggressive capacity. And of course, a very similar thing happens in the fairy tale Vasilisa the Beautiful, where Vasilisa goes to Baba Yaga, this fearsome cannibalistic witch who lives in the Russian woods. And she serves her. You have to serve the dark goddess. Mm-hmm. And what you get from that is this power to kind of be a badass. Yeah. So she leaves Baba Yaga's hut with this skull with glowing eyes that sets fire to her wicked stepmother and stepsisters.
So that's an interesting point you're making, that the mentor can be somebody who is very difficult, somebody who's even an enemy. It doesn't all have to be nicey nice. Come with me, young woman, and I'll take you by the hand.
Oh, it's challenging.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that movie, The Devil Wears Prada, with Meryl Streep and Anne Hathaway, where Meryl Streep is this very, very accomplished, very demanding designer, uncompromising, totally unsentimental, and disinterested in mothering anyone around her. And Anne Hathaway comes in as an intern who's very sweet and nice.
She's the ingenue.
Yeah, casual. And she thinks that she's going to kind of smile her way through this initiation, through the internship. And Meryl Streep just looks at all of that kind of naivete and lets her know throughout the course of the movie that will not do. And rightly so. It prevents Anne Hathaway from becoming excellent, which is really the whole point of the internship. And towards the end, there's a wonderful moment in the movie where Anne Hathaway says something really dismissive about a design decision. And Meryl Streep just really calmly looks at her and gives her the entire kind of industry understanding of why cerulean blue is important or not important, and tracks that through this incredible, intricate system, which leaves Anne Hathaway just her jaw hanging down. And she finally realizes that Meryl Streep is a wisdom figure and that there's a huge amount of her own childish arrogance that she needs to set aside and really become a sponge and drink in this opportunity. And finally, in the end, she leaves and goes off to another position. And, she and Meryl Streep just kind of take a moment where they just nod slightly or, tip their hats and
that's
then just
great.
go their separate ways. Not sentimental, not tears, just a kind of acknowledgement of mutual potency and
The
excellence.
older woman recognizing the potential in the younger woman. I love that you use the term wisdom figure, because I think it's true that in many of these stories, she begins as a witch, and then we see that she's really a wisdom figure. It's the way that the thing that stands in your path in the beginning, that you decry and that you feel is unfair and that it's doing you wrong or whatever, that's what you need to learn. That's what you need to come to terms with.
We run into this a lot of times when we go to university, and all of a sudden you have a teacher, a female teacher, who's just really clear about what it is you need to absorb and demonstrate in order to thrive in this subject area. People are crabby and, oh, she's this and she's that. And yet they'll come back years later and say, you are the teacher that gave me what I needed 5 years forward. And I couldn't appreciate it. And I was full of piss and vinegar all about it. But all of that rigor was exactly what was needed.
Well, and I think some of us can relate to a moment like that in analytic training.
Yeah.
I'm thinking too that, the storied role of the mother-in-law can often be exactly that kind of thing of you're not doing things right. This isn't how you're supposed to keep house. It's not how you raise a child. And that moment where the witch and the bitch becomes a teacher and a wisdom figure of the young woman saying, but this is how I'm doing it. This is my home, my kids, my house. That moment of stepping into through a moment of rebellion, but stepping into one's own authority and realizing I have the power.
Yep. And I think that's really beautiful. And it brings up this little distinction is that I think that in The Devil Wears Prada, we sort of know that the Meryl Streep character really wants at the end for Anne Hathaway to soar. And I don't know that that's always true with a mother-in-law scenario, even a mythological one.
I agree.
But you're right that it plays the same role because it's something to push up against.
Exactly.
And in pushing up against it, we find our own backbone.
Yes.
But not all hostility is an attempt to bring wisdom forward.
That's right.
And that's really the difference. Sometimes hostility, somebody who's in authority is hostile because they're a pot that's boiling over all over the office.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not initiated, and they don't even know why they're constantly, throwing lava on everyone.
It's not at all, as you're saying, as if there's underneath this, there's goodness and goodwill operating, but it is about what do you do with it? Of one way or another, the younger woman, the would-be initiate, has to find her own power. And that's what it's all about. This is your life, and you have decisions and choices and empowerment to some degree at hand, also known as consciousness. It's not as if you have the power to become queen or you have the power to, run a big corporation, but you do have the power to become consciousness, to see what's going on.
And to take responsibility for yourself.
Exactly.
Yes, that only you can fight for your own liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody else does it for you, it isn't a liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe this is a time to transition into a dream. Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. you'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you. Our dreamer is a 37-year-old male who works as a musician and a composer. And here's the dream. I was playing a concert with a famous elder statesman of bluegrass. We play a funny song about cat that travels with its owner in a semi-tractor trailer across the U.S. The song begins with me playing the bass and with the cat making some kind of a meow. My cat, all gray, yellow eyes, born without a tail, was laying next to me on stage, curled up on top of a stool. The cat's presence gave me comfort, humor, and warmth. At the end of the song, the lights went dark. A spotlight forms above the elder statesman, casting shadows across his feature. He turns to me and gets very close to my face. I feel pressure at being the focus of attention. He produces a large stack of cards below his chin and starts showing them to me one by one. At first, the cards and numbers don't make sense. He draws 10, then 13. Maybe he can't guess the numbers my mind is picking. All of a sudden, the trick begins to work. He picks 24, 48, and 72. He is drawing the cards I'm thinking of, and from a very large stack. These numbers are bigger than a deck of playing cards, yet they are similarly designed, quite intricate. I'm shocked, not afraid, that he knows the numbers. The elder smirks slightly with a knowing smile. He gives a bit of context. An important mentor and music teacher just passed from COVID. This teacher really laid the foundation that supports my life as a musician. Members of my family also take from him and got COVID as a result. My family's been very nihilistic and unwilling to take responsibility for COVID or its spread. Their attitude illuminated a distance between us that I didn't realize. I had a great relationship with them as a child. Now I can see that we are very different, and I have deferred to them too often when making my choices for my life. The audience was to my right and the cat to my left, and I was playing a guitar that sounded like an old electric bass from the 50s. The main feelings in the dream were fun, warmth, appreciation, then shock, curiosity, and disbelief. And then he adds, the elder statesman in the dream is someone I've met several times in real life and have friends from his band. He's very generous and sincere and quite active in performing. He's known to be someone who grew up in the music and is carrying on the tradition. I've sent an audition tape to him via a friend, but never got a chance to perform with him. The cat. I would just like to tell the listeners that Marie-Louise von Franz wrote a whole book called The Cat, on the symbolism of cat, because it shows up so frequently in fairy tales and myths as a really compelling image.
Yeah, and there's a cat in the song, and then there's his cat who's with him on stage. So he's being companioned. This is a cat that travels with its owner, and his cat is companioning him on stage. So there's some kind of access to a sort of feminine instinctual energy.
Mm-hmm.
And he says the cat's presence gave me more humor and comfort.
And then the elder statesman becomes a kind of magician.
Mm-hmm.
So we go from music, the cat, to the magician. And this feeling of numinosity, feeling astounded in this kind of psychic demonstration later in the dream.
Yeah, one of the things that's coming up for me is that he says that this elder statesman is someone who grew up in this musical culture and is kind of carrying on the tradition. So this is someone who has access to, I want to say, like ancestral knowledge or a long tradition. And it seems significant in terms of the context he's given for the dream, because so being able to pull on a long tradition, a philosophical tradition, a religious tradition, an artistic tradition, can stand in or replace when we find that we can no longer rely on our family for guidance. Part of the process of separating from family psychologically is often involves finding a wisdom tradition, for example, that we can turn to for guidance as we begin to separate from our family and see that their values are not necessarily our values.
I'm thinking that both the cat and this famous elder statesman are companions and kind of mentors in a kind of initiation of this dream ego. The cat is there on stage and provides the comfort, humor, and warmth. And then there's this whole process of the cards, where the dream ego first feels anxious or pressure at being the focus of attention, he says. And then they're supposed to be in sync. You know, that the older man draws numbers. Maybe he can't guess the numbers my mind is picking. But then the mentor does seem to get in sync with the dream ego's mind and draws the numbers that the dreamer is thinking about. So I'm thinking that this in the context of how he's separating from his family and finding some differences with his family of origin, that there is a mentoring and companioning into a different kind of awareness.
I think the mentoring relationship is really significant. And the fact that his lived mentor has just passed from COVID. So to me, it's that old phrase, the king is dead, long live the king.
That's perfect.
So something is passing from the image of the deceased mentor into the dreamer.
Yeah.
That he is the king that's left on stage. And that in the dream, I think he is absorbing some of the mystery of the old king, the old Hierophant in some ways. The word Hierophant means the revealer of the sacred. And so the old Hierophant is revealing this capacity to be extraordinarily connected in this unconscious to unconscious way, and this ability to perceive number and sequence, which the dreamer, as a composer and a musician, lives in a world of numerical sensibilities, because composing is a highly numerical process.
Yes, that's great.
What I'm moved to say to the dreamer is, do you know where playing cards come from? There's an archetypal underpinning to playing cards, which are tarot cards.
Yeah, that's great.
And I'm wondering if the dream maker is encouraging him to look at that archetypal image system of the tarot, and that there may be something useful for him in that. And to that end, I would recommend reading The Tarot, A Key to the Wisdom of the Ages by Paul Foster Case, which will really give you a deep dive into the symbolism of the tarot, which is a really serious Hellenistic repository that will might be really interesting.
Yeah, that's a wonderful amplification, Joseph. And I think just in general, the idea of playing cards or games archetypally have the significance as being about fate and dealing with kind of cosmology, because the way that life is a game, as it were. And so I wonder if there's something about this encounter on stage. It's challenging. There's a bright light. It's very close to the mentor is very close to his face. And I wonder if it isn't something about a fateful encounter, an encounter with fate, having that shown to him, having his fate shown to him, as it were.
And coming into being himself in a new way with the passing, in a sense, of this tradition from this elder, from the king, through knowing the card numbers. And what he says in the context around his family is that he says, I have deferred to them too often when making choices for my life. And that in this dream, he's moving into a very different position of this fate and kind of archetypal encounter with these numbers. And he says in the dream, I'm not afraid that he knows the numbers, and that the elder smirks with a knowing smile. So I think this is truly a fateful encounter, that we have something here from the archetypal realm with the cards and the elder. And as you said, Joseph, long live the king. The king is dead. He's come into his own sense of choicefulness and empowerment.
Yeah, so this is a dream of initiation, as it were.
Absolutely.
It feels that way. And 37 is the perfect time for that to happen. It's right there in midlife, where we've been under the thrall of the culture, our education, our family, our religion, all the different things that give us structure, which we need in the first half of life. And now beginning to feel that there is a progressed vision of himself that is being nurtured in the unconscious. And that when that begins to shine a bit, which I think is in the image of the elder in the dream, it creates this stirring of intensity that one has to move forward to embodying the progressed image of the self. And that requires the dissolution and the separation from old things that are not congruent.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show, and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.